Maria Santos had always been the quiet one in her family. While her three brothers commanded attention with their loud voices and bold gestures, she preferred to observe from the corners, taking mental notes of everything around her. At 28, she worked as a data analyst for a small consulting firm in downtown Phoenix, living in a modest apartment that her family rarely visited. Her parents, immigrants from El Salvador, had built their American dream around their son's achievements: Carlos the lawyer, Miguel the doctor, and Roberto the successful businessman. Maria's steady but unremarkable career seemed to fade into the background of their conversations. The call came on a Tuesday evening while she was reviewing quarterly reports. Her mother's voice cracked through the phone, barely coherent between sobs. "Maria, something terrible has happened. Your father, he's been arrested. They say he took money that wasn't his. The FBI came to the house this morning." Maria's hands trembled as she set down her coffee mug. Her father, Eduardo Santos, had worked for the same construction company for 15 years, slowly climbing from laborer to project supervisor. The idea of him stealing anything seemed impossible. He was the man who returned extra change at the grocery store, who insisted on paying his taxes early every year. "What kind of money, Mama? How much are they talking about?" "They say $2 million. $2 million, Maria? Where would your father even see that kind of money?" Her mother's voice dissolved into another wave of tears. Maria closed her laptop and grabbed her car keys. The drive to her parents' house in the suburbs felt endless, her mind racing through possibilities. When she arrived, she found chaos. News. Vans lined the street. Reporters shoving microphones toward anyone who walked by. Police tape still fluttered around the front yard, and neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering and pointing. Inside the house, her brothers had already assembled. Carlos paced the living room in his expensive suit, his phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders to someone about damage control. Miguel sat at the kitchen table with financial documents spread before him, his medical precision applied to examining bank statements. Roberto stood by the window, his jaw tight as he watched the media circus outside. "Finally," Carlos said when Maria walked in. "We need to figure out how to handle this mess. The press is going to destroy our family's reputation." Maria looked around the room where she had grown up, at the family photos covering every surface, at her mother huddled in the corner chair she had occupied for decades. "What about Papa? Where is he now?" "County jail," Miguel answered, without looking up from the papers. "Bail is set at $500,000. We're trying to figure out if we can cover it." "Can we afford that?" Maria asked. Roberto laughed bitterly. "Between the three of us, we can probably manage it, but it'll clean us out. The question is whether it's worth the risk if he's actually guilty." "He's not guilty," their mother whispered from her chair. "Eduardo would never steal, never." Carlos stopped pacing. "Mama, they found the money transfers in his company accounts. His signature is on the authorization forms. We have to face the possibility that—" "That what?" Maria interrupted, her voice sharper than usual. "That our father suddenly decided to become a thief after 62 years of being the most honest man we know." Her brothers exchanged glances. She could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they had already begun calculating how this would affect their own careers and social standing. Carlos had political aspirations. Miguel's medical practice served wealthy clients who valued reputation above all else. Roberto's business partners were already asking uncomfortable questions. Over the next 3 days, Maria watched her family fragment. Her brothers hired expensive lawyers who spoke in legal jargon and presented worst-case scenarios. They discussed plea bargains and damage control strategies. They talked about their father as if he were already convicted, already lost to them. But Maria couldn't accept it. She took a leave of absence from her job and began her own investigation. While her brothers focused on managing the crisis, she focused on understanding it. She obtained copies of the case files through a paralegal friend, studied the financial records until her eyes burned, and mapped out every transaction that had triggered the investigation. The construction company, Henderson Development, had been Eduardo's world for 15 years. He had started as a day laborer, sending money home to his family while learning English at night. Slowly, he had earned the trust of the owner, James Henderson, who promoted him to supervisor, then project manager, and finally operations coordinator. Eduardo oversaw crews of 40 men, managed supply deliveries, and coordinated with subcontractors on projects worth millions. According to the FBI investigation, the theft had occurred over 18 months. Money had been systematically diverted from client accounts into a series of shell companies, then transferred to offshore accounts. The trail led directly to Eduardo's computer login credentials and his electronic signature on the authorization forms. Maria spent her evenings at the jail, visiting her father through reinforced glass. He looked smaller each time she saw him, his shoulders curved inward as if protecting himself from invisible blows. His English, usually careful but confident, became scattered and confused under the weight of his circumstances. "I don't understand, Misha," he told her during one visit. "Mr. Henderson, he trusted me with everything. I signed papers every day, payroll, supplies, contractor payments. Maybe I signed something wrong, maybe I didn't read careful enough. Papa, do you remember signing anything unusual? Anything that seemed different from your normal work?" Eduardo's brow furrowed with concentration. The last months, Mr. Henderson was very busy. New investors, big projects. He gave me many papers to sign. He said it was routine, just keeping the money flowing while he traveled. I trusted him, Maria. He gave me opportunities when no one else would. Maria felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had been assuming the investigation was wrong, that some computer error or identity theft had implicated her father. But what if the investigation was right about the theft, just wrong about who was really responsible? That night she called her brothers to share her suspicions about Henderson. Carlos was the first to respond. "Maria, you're grasping at straws. The evidence against Papa is overwhelming. We need to focus on getting him the best plea deal possible. What if Henderson used Papa as a fall guy? What if he knew Papa would sign whatever he asked him to sign because Papa trusted him?" "Even if that were true," Miguel said, "proving it would be nearly impossible. We don't have the resources for that kind of investigation." Roberto was more blunt. "Maria, I know you want to believe Papa is innocent, but we have to be realistic. The family business interests I represent can't be associated with this scandal much longer. We need resolution, not conspiracy theories." Maria hung up the phone feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. Her brothers had written off their father to protect their own futures. Her mother was drowning in grief and confusion. The media had already convicted Eduardo in the court of public opinion. The legal system was grinding forward with mechanical efficiency, processing another case in an endless queue. But Maria had something her family didn't expect. She had inherited her father's stubborn work ethic and her mother's fierce loyalty. More importantly, she had skills they had overlooked. Years of analyzing data, finding patterns, and solving problems had prepared her for this moment. While everyone else saw an impossible situation, she saw a puzzle that could be solved. She just had to figure out how to solve it alone. Maria's investigation began in the most unlikely place, her childhood bedroom. She had moved back into her parents' house temporarily, partly to support her mother, and partly because she needed to save money for what she was planning. The pink wallpaper and high school trophies felt surreal against the backdrop of FBI files and financial documents she spread across her old desk. Her first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While organizing her father's personal papers to help with the legal defense, she found his daily planners from the past 2 years. Eduardo had always been meticulous about scheduling, writing down every meeting, every phone call, every task in his careful handwriting. Maria cross-referenced these entries with the dates of the suspicious money transfers. A pattern emerged that made her pulse quicken. On 17 of the 23 dates when major transfers occurred, Eduardo had been scheduled for off-site meetings, training sessions, or client visits. He had been physically away from the office when his computer credentials were used to authorize the transfers. Maria photographed every relevant page and created a timeline on her laptop. She color-coded Eduardo's verified locations against the transfer dates, building a visual map that clearly showed the impossibility of his direct involvement in most of the thefts. But she knew this evidence alone wouldn't be enough, and defense attorneys had probably already identified these discrepancies. The prosecution would argue that Eduardo could have authorized the transfers before leaving the office, or that he had accomplices. She needed to understand how the Henderson development computer system actually worked. Maria called the company's main number, disguising her voice and claiming to be a potential contractor interested in their payment processing procedures. The receptionist transferred her to the accounting department, where a friendly woman named Janet explained their workflow. "Oh, we have a very secure system," Janet said proudly. "All major expenditures require dual authorization. The project manager has to input the request. Then Mr. Henderson or one of the senior coordinators has to approve it electronically. We upgraded the whole system about 2 years ago after our insurance company required better financial controls." Maria felt her heart racing. "So every transaction needs 2 people to sign off on it?" "Exactly. Mr. Henderson was very particular about that after some problems we had with unauthorized overtime payments. Now everything over $5,000 needs 2 signatures in the system." After hanging up, Maria stared at her timeline with new understanding. If Henderson development required dual authorization for large expenditures, then either Eduardo had a collaborator she hadn't identified, or someone else had been using both sets of credentials. Neither possibility fit with the FBI's theory that Eduardo was working alone. She needed to get inside Henderson development, but a direct approach was impossible. The company was cooperating fully with the federal investigation, and any suspicious inquiries would be reported immediately. Maria spent 3 days researching the company's operations before she found her opportunity. Henderson Development was in the final stages of completing a luxury hotel project downtown. Like most major construction sites, they relied on temporary workers from staffing agencies to supplement their permanent crews. Maria had never done construction work in her life, but she was desperate enough to try anything. She applied to 3 different staffing agencies, emphasizing her bilingual abilities and claiming previous experience in construction administration. Within a week, she was assigned to a 2-day job organizing supply deliveries at the hotel site. It wasn't much, but it would get her inside the company's daily operations. The construction site was a maze of scaffolding, concrete mixers, and workers in hard hats moving with practiced efficiency. Maria wore borrowed work boots and carried a clipboard, trying to blend in while absorbing every detail around her. Her job was simple: check delivery receipts against purchase orders and flag any discrepancies for the site supervisor. By lunchtime on her first day, she had identified the site supervisor as Tommy Rodriguez, a man in his 50s who had worked with Eduardo for over a decade. During their break, Maria carefully steered the conversation toward her father. "I heard Eduardo Santos got arrested," she said casually. "Did you know him?" Tommy's face darkened. "Eduardo was the best coordinator we ever had. Honest as the day is long. This whole thing stinks if you ask me." "What do you mean?" Tommy looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Eduardo wasn't the kind of guy who would steal a candy bar, much less $2 million. But there's been weird stuff happening around here for months. Computer problems, missing paperwork, projects getting approved that nobody remembered requesting." Maria's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice neutral. "Computer problems?" "System kept logging people in and out at strange times. Eduardo complained about it more than once. Said his login showed him accessing files when he was home with his family. IT department kept saying it was just glitches in the new software." That afternoon, Maria volunteered to help organize the site office's filing cabinets. While sorting through purchase orders and delivery receipts, she photographed anything that seemed relevant to her father's case. More importantly, she observed the office's daily routines and identified the location of the main computer terminal. Her plan was risky and probably illegal, but desperation had pushed her past caring about normal ethical boundaries. That evening, she researched the hotel's security schedule and studied blueprints she found online. The construction site was monitored by security cameras and patrolled by guards, but the office trailer where the computer terminal was located had only basic locks and a single camera focused on the entrance. Maria returned to the site at 2 in the morning, dressed in dark clothing and carrying a small backpack with basic tools she had purchased at a hardware store. She approached the office trailer from the blind spot she had identified, used bolt cutters to access the fenced area, and picked the simple lock on the trailer door, a skill she had learned from YouTube videos during her week of preparation. Inside the trailer, she powered up the computer terminal and inserted a USB drive containing software she had downloaded from a cybersecurity forum. The program was designed to recover deleted files and examine system logs for evidence of unauthorized access. While it ran, Maria photographed filing cabinets and desk drawers looking for any physical evidence that might support her theory about Henderson's involvement. The software finished its scan after 40 minutes. Maria copied the results to her USB drive and was preparing to leave when she heard voices outside. 2 security guards were conducting their routine patrol, their flashlight beams sweeping across the construction equipment near the trailer. Maria crouched below the window line and waited, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure the guards would hear it. The voices grew closer, then stopped directly outside the trailer. One of the guards was trying the door handle. "That's weird," he said to his partner. "This door is usually locked. Maybe the day shift supervisor forgot to secure it. We should check inside." Maria looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the trailer was essentially a single room with nowhere to conceal herself. She could hear keys jingling as one of the guards searched for the right one to unlock the door. In desperation, she grabbed her phone and called 911, whispering urgently about suspicious activity she had witnessed at a construction site 3 blocks away. Within minutes, she could hear sirens in the distance. The guard's radio crackled to life, dispatching them to investigate the disturbance she had reported. As soon as they left to respond to the call, Maria slipped out of the trailer, secured the door behind her, and escaped through the fence opening she had created. Back in her car several blocks away, she examined the data she had stolen. The computer logs revealed exactly what she had hoped to find: a pattern of after-hours system access that corresponded with the dates of the fraudulent transfers. Someone had been logging into the system using Eduardo's credentials during times when he was verifiably elsewhere. More importantly, the logs showed that most of these late-night sessions originated from an administrator account with system-level privileges, access that only a handful of people possessed. The account belonged to James Henderson himself. Maria spent the rest of the night analyzing the data, cross-referencing it with her father's schedule and the financial records from the FBI investigation. A clear picture emerged of systematic fraud that had been carefully designed to implicate Eduardo while protecting the real perpetrator. But she knew that stolen evidence would never be admissible in court, and she had probably committed several felonies obtaining it. Her brothers would be horrified if they knew what she had done. Her father would be heartbroken that she had risked her own freedom for his sake. However, Maria had found the trail that could lead to the truth. She just needed to figure out how to expose it without destroying herself in the process. The real investigation was just beginning, and she was running out of time. Eduardo's trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks, and the prosecution was confident they had an airtight case. Maria stared at her computer screen as dawn broke outside her childhood bedroom window. She had crossed a line that night, transitioning from Maria knew she needed professional help, but she couldn't afford the kind of private investigator her brothers would hire. Instead, she reached out to someone from her past, David Kim, a former college classmate who now worked as a forensic accountant for insurance companies. They had dated briefly during their senior year, and she hoped he might be willing to help based on their old friendship. David agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown, though he seemed puzzled by her request for discretion. When Maria explained the situation, his expression grew increasingly concerned. "Maria, what you're describing sounds like you've committed breaking and entering, computer trespassing, and probably several other felonies," he said quietly. "Even if your father is innocent, you could end up in prison yourself." "I know the risks," she replied, "but I also know my father didn't steal that money. The evidence I found proves that someone else was using his credentials." David studied the printouts she had brought, his professional training taking over despite his personal concerns. After 20 minutes of analysis, he looked up with a mixture of admiration and worry. "This is actually quite sophisticated," he admitted. "If these logs are authentic, they show a clear pattern of credential theft and system manipulation. But the problem is chain of custody. Any lawyer could get this evidence thrown out because of how you obtained it." What if we could find a legal way to prove the same thing? David was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out his laptop. There might be a way. Henderson Development's insurance company would have required them to install monitoring software after upgrading their financial systems. Insurance companies don't trust contractors with large cash flows. They want independent verification that security protocols are being followed. He spent several minutes typing and making phone calls, using his professional connections in the insurance industry. Finally, he turned back to Maria with cautious optimism. Henderson Development's bonding company is Meridian Insurance. I've worked with them before. They have real-time monitoring software installed on all of Henderson's financial systems, and they keep independent backups of all transaction logs. If your theory is correct, those backups should show the same pattern of fraudulent access you found. Can you get access to those records? Not directly, but I can request an audit on behalf of one of my insurance company clients. If Meridian finds evidence of systemic fraud, they'll be required to investigate further to protect their own liability. It was a long shot, but it was also the only legal path forward that Maria could see. David agreed to initiate the audit request, though he warned her that the process could take weeks and might not yield the results she hoped for. While waiting for David's investigation to proceed, Maria decided to research James Henderson more thoroughly. She spent hours online, digging through public records, business filings, and social media profiles. What she found painted a picture of a man under increasing financial pressure. Henderson Development had been struggling for the past 2 years, losing several major contracts to larger competitors and facing cost overruns on existing projects. Henderson's personal finances appeared equally strained. He had recently taken out a second mortgage on his house and had been named in 2 separate lawsuits related to unpaid debts. More troubling was what Maria discovered about Henderson's previous business ventures. Before starting the construction company, he had been involved in 3 other companies that had ended in bankruptcy or legal disputes. In each case, Henderson had emerged with his personal assets intact while partners or investors suffered significant losses. The pattern suggested a man who was comfortable with financial manipulation and had experience shifting liability to others when his schemes collapsed. Eduardo's trusting nature and limited understanding of complex financial systems would have made him an ideal scapegoat. Maria's research was interrupted by an unexpected phone call from her brother Carlos. His voice was tight with anger when she answered. "Maria, what the hell have you been doing? I just got a call from Henderson's attorney asking if our family had hired a private investigator to harass their client." Maria's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? Someone has been asking questions about Henderson's finances, requesting records from his insurance company, digging through his business history. His lawyer thinks it's connected to Papa's case, and he's threatening to file harassment charges. If it continues, Carlos, I can explain. No explanations. Whatever amateur detective work you think you're doing needs to stop immediately. You're going to make things worse for Papa, and you might get yourself arrested in the process. But what if I'm right? What if Henderson is the real thief?" Carlos's laugh was bitter. "Even if Henderson is guilty, do you think the FBI is just going to admit they were wrong and apologize? They've invested months in this case, Maria. They're not going to change course because Eduardo's daughter thinks she's found something they missed." After Carlos hung up, Maria sat in her car outside the coffee shop where she had met David, trying to process the implications of Henderson's defensive response. The fact that he was already taking legal action suggested she was on the right track, but it also meant she was running out of time. Her phone rang again, this time with David's number on the caller ID. "Maria, we need to meet immediately," he said without preamble. "I found something, but it's complicated." They met at David's office after hours when his colleagues had gone home. He had printed out dozens of pages of insurance monitoring reports and spread them across his conference table. "The good news is that your theory was correct," he said. "Meridian's monitoring software captured everything: unauthorized system access, credential spoofing, even keystroke logging that shows someone typing commands Eduardo would never have known how to use." Maria felt a surge of vindication. "So, we have proof that Henderson was using Papa's login credentials? We have proof that someone was using Eduardo's credentials inappropriately." The problem is that the monitoring software doesn't identify the physical person at the keyboard. It only records which computer the commands came from. David pulled up a detailed technical report on his laptop. Here's where it gets interesting. Most of the fraudulent transactions were initiated from Henderson's office computer, but they were executed using Eduardo's credentials through a remote access protocol. Henderson could claim that Eduardo had remote access to the system and was working from home or another location. But Papa barely knows how to send email. He would never have known how to use remote access software. You and I know that, but proving it in court would be difficult. Henderson's lawyers would argue that Eduardo was more technically sophisticated than his family realized, or that someone taught him how to use the remote system as part of the conspiracy. Maria stared at the reports, feeling her hope beginning to fade. Every piece of evidence seemed to come with a built-in defense that Henderson's expensive lawyers could exploit. "There's one more thing," David said quietly. "I found evidence of 2 previous insurance claims against Henderson Development for employee theft. In both cases, the accused employees were immigrants with limited English skills who claimed they had been tricked into signing documents they didn't understand. What happened to them? One plea bargained to a reduced sentence and was deported. The other fought the charges but was convicted and served 2 years in federal prison. Neither case went to trial. The evidence was too overwhelming. The pattern was becoming clear, and it made Maria sick to her stomach. Henderson had been using the same scheme for years, targeting vulnerable employees who would make sympathetic scapegoats while he systematically looted his own company's accounts. "David, we have to find a way to expose this. If Papa goes to prison, Henderson will just find another victim for his next theft." David nodded, but his expression was grim. "The problem is that everything we've discovered so far is circumstantial. We can show suspicious patterns and suggest alternative explanations, but we don't have direct evidence of Henderson's guilt. And with his lawyers already threatening legal action, we're running out of ways to investigate further." Maria looked at the evidence spread across the conference table. Months of careful work that might not be enough to save her father. Her brothers had given up. The legal system was grinding forward with mechanical efficiency, and time was running out. But Henderson had made one critical mistake in his careful planning. By threatening legal action, he had revealed that Maria's investigation was making him nervous. A truly innocent man would have ignored her amateur detective work or cooperated fully with any reasonable inquiry. His defensive response told her she was close to something that could destroy him. She just needed to figure out what that something was and how to find it before her father's trial began. The clock was ticking, and Maria was about to discover that her real test wasn't finding the truth. It was surviving long enough to expose it. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Maria was leaving the county jail after visiting her father when she encountered Janet Morrison, the accounting clerk from Henderson Development, whom she had spoken to on the phone weeks earlier. Janet was sitting in her car in the parking lot crying. Maria approached carefully, introducing herself as Eduardo's daughter. Janet's reaction was immediate and intense. She grabbed Maria's arm with desperate strength. "I've been wanting to talk to someone about this for weeks," Janet whispered, glancing around nervously. "But I'm scared. Mr. Henderson made it very clear that anyone who talks about the company's internal affairs will be fired and blacklisted from every construction company in the state. What do you know about what happened to my father?" Janet's hands shook as she reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. "I kept records of everything unusual that happened in the past year. The computer problems, the strange payment, authorizations, the times when Mr. Henderson insisted on handling transactions personally instead of following normal procedures." Maria's heart began racing. "Can I see those records?" "Not here. Mr. Henderson has people watching the employees he considers potential problems. But I get off work at 6 tomorrow. Meet me at the Denny's on Central Avenue at 7. That night, Maria could barely sleep. She had been operating on theories and circumstantial evidence for weeks, but Janet represented the possibility of insider testimony that could actually change the outcome of her father's case. She called David to update him, and he agreed to attend the meeting as a witness and to help evaluate any evidence Janet might provide. The next evening, Janet arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes late. constantly checking over her shoulder as if expecting to be followed. She was a woman in her early 40s, with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who had been carrying a heavy secret. "I should have spoken up months ago," she began after they had settled into a corner booth. "But I was afraid of losing my job. I'm a single mother with 2 kids, and jobs aren't easy to find in this economy." Maria leaned forward. "What did you see?" Janet opened her notebook and began reading from her carefully maintained entries. The picture that emerged was even more damning than Maria had hoped. Henderson had been systematically bypassing the company's security protocols, using his administrative access to authorize large payments without the required dual approval system. "He told me the approvals were just a formality for internal transfers," Janet explained. "He said Eduardo had already signed off on everything, and we were just updating the computer records to match the paperwork." "But Eduardo wasn't even in the office for most of those transactions," Maria said. "I know that now. But at the time, Mr. Henderson showed me signed authorization forms with Eduardo's signature. He said Eduardo had pre-signed them before going to his off-site meetings, and we just needed to process them electronically." David had been taking notes throughout Janet's testimony. Now he looked up with a sharp expression. "Do you still have any of those signed authorization forms?" Janet's face paled. "That's the problem. About 3 weeks ago, Mr. Henderson collected all the physical paperwork related to those transactions. He said the FBI had requested copies and he needed to organize everything for the investigators. Did you make copies before giving them to him?" "Not copies, but—" Janet hesitated, then reached into her purse again. This time she pulled out a small digital camera. "I started taking pictures of important documents after some previous problems with missing paperwork. I have photos of 12 different authorization forms that Eduardo supposedly signed." Maria felt a surge of excitement, but David's expression remained cautious. "What makes these forms significant?" Janet scrolled through the photos on her camera's display screen. "Look at the signatures. I've seen Eduardo's real signature hundreds of times on routine paperwork. These signatures are similar, but they're not the same. The letter formations are slightly different, and the pressure patterns don't match." She handed the camera to David, who studied the images with the trained eye of someone who had spent years analyzing financial documents for evidence of fraud. After several minutes, he looked up with growing excitement. "Maria, these signatures are definitely forgeries. They're good forgeries. Whoever did this spent time studying Eduardo's actual signature. But there are consistent variations that would be obvious to a handwriting expert." "Could we get a handwriting analysis done?" "Absolutely. And unlike the computer evidence, these photographs would be admissible in court because Janet took them as part of her normal job duties, not through illegal surveillance." Janet's nervousness increased as she realized the implications of what she was revealing. "If I testify about this, Mr. Henderson will destroy me. He'll make sure I never work in this industry again." Maria reached across the table and took Janet's hands. "If you don't testify, my father will spend the next 10 years in federal prison for something he didn't do, and Henderson will keep using this same scheme to steal from other companies and ruin other families." "What about protection? If Henderson is willing to frame an innocent man for theft, what might he do to someone who threatens to expose him?" David had been thinking about the same question. "We need to move quickly and carefully. Janet, can you get copies of Eduardo's genuine signatures from routine company paperwork? We'll need comparison samples for the handwriting analysis. I can get those tomorrow. But once I start copying files, Henderson might notice if he's monitoring our computer activity. Then we need to get everything we need in one comprehensive effort," Maria said. "Janet, what other evidence might exist that could prove Henderson's guilt?" Janet thought carefully. "There are security camera recordings from the office building. Henderson always claimed he was working late when these transactions occurred, but the cameras would show whether he was actually in the building. Also, his computer would have logs showing when he accessed the authorization system." "Can you get access to those records?" "Not directly, but I know the building manager. The security company keeps the camera recordings for 60 days before deleting them. We're getting close to that deadline for some of the theft dates." The three of them spent the next hour developing a plan. Janet would gather signature samples and any other relevant documents she could access without raising suspicion. David would arrange for an emergency handwriting analysis through his professional contacts. Maria would approach the building manager about the security recordings, using her cover story as a concerned family member seeking evidence to help her father's defense. It was a risky strategy that required perfect coordination and a significant amount of luck. If Henderson discovered their investigation before they could compile their evidence, he would have time to destroy additional records and potentially intimidate Janet into remaining silent. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Janet grabbed Maria's arm one final time. "There's something else you should know. Last week, Mr. Henderson received a call from someone about a job at a construction company in Denver. He's been making arrangements to relocate his business operations to Colorado within the next month." Maria felt her stomach drop. "He's planning to disappear?" "It looks that way. He told the staff it was a temporary expansion, but he's been quietly transferring equipment and closing local contracts. If he leaves before your father's trial, it will be much harder to investigate him or compel his testimony." The timeline had just become much more urgent. Eduardo's trial was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks, and Henderson was apparently planning to leave the state before then. Maria realized she wasn't just racing against the legal system anymore. She was racing against a man who had spent months planning his escape route. That night, she called her father's defense attorney and requested an emergency meeting. She didn't have all the evidence yet, but she had enough to demand a more thorough investigation of Henderson's role in the theft. The attorney was skeptical, but agreed to review any documentation she could provide. Maria stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing the determined woman looking back at her. 2 months ago, she had been a quiet data analyst who avoided confrontation and lived in her brother's shadows. Now she was orchestrating a complex investigation that could either save her father or destroy what remained of her family. Tomorrow would determine whether her desperate gamble would pay off, or whether she had waited too long to uncover the truth. Henderson had the resources, connections, and legal protection that came with being a successful businessman. But Maria had something he hadn't counted on: the relentless determination of a daughter who refused to let her father be sacrificed for another man's crimes. The final phase of her mission was about to begin. The next morning, Maria received a call that made her blood run cold. Janet's voice was barely a whisper, and she was clearly terrified. "Maria, something's wrong. When I got to work today, my computer access was restricted, and my desk was searched. Mr. Henderson called me into his office and asked if I had been talking to anyone about company business." "What did you tell him?" "I denied everything, but I think he knows. He mentioned that the building security company had reported unusual interest in their surveillance records. Someone must have seen you talking to the building manager yesterday." Maria's heart sank. Their careful plan was unraveling before they had even gathered the evidence they needed. "Janet, you need to get out of there. Can you leave work early today?" "He's making me stay late tonight to catch up on filing. I think he wants to keep an eye on me. Maria, I'm scared. What if he tries to frame me too?" "Listen carefully. Go to the bathroom and call David Kim right now. I'm sending you his number. Tell him everything you told me last night and ask him to arrange protective custody through his insurance company contacts. They have security protocols for witnesses in fraud cases." After hanging up, Maria realized their timeline had collapsed completely. Henderson was clearly aware that someone was investigating him, and he would be moving quickly to eliminate evidence and neutralize threats. She needed to accelerate every aspect of their plan, even if it meant taking dangerous risks. Her first call was to her father's defense attorney, Patricia Valdez. Patricia had been skeptical of Maria's theories, but she agreed to an emergency meeting after Maria explained that key evidence might be destroyed within hours. They met at Patricia's office at noon. Maria presented everything she had compiled: the computer access logs from her illegal break-in, Janet's photographs of forged signatures, David's insurance company findings, and her research into Henderson's financial problems and previous business failures. Patricia studied the materials with the focused intensity of someone who had spent 20 years defending clients in federal court, After an hour of analysis, she looked up with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Maria, what you've uncovered could completely change your father's case. The handwriting evidence alone would create reasonable doubt, and the pattern of previous fraudulent businesses is exactly the kind of background evidence that could convince a jury that Henderson is the real perpetrator. Can we get the charges dropped?" "Not immediately. The prosecution has invested too much in this case to abandon it based on evidence obtained through questionable methods. But we can definitely force them to investigate Henderson more thoroughly, and we might be able to negotiate a plea agreement that keeps Eduardo out of prison." "What about Henderson leaving the state?" Patricia's expression darkened. "If Henderson flees before we can present this evidence, it will be much harder to prove your father's innocence. We need to move immediately to prevent his departure and secure the remaining evidence." She began making phone calls while Maria waited, contacting federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and her own private investigator. The wheels of the legal system began turning with unusual speed, as Patricia leveraged her professional relationships to demand immediate action. Within 2 hours, Maria received a call from David with promising news. The handwriting expert I contacted has agreed to do an emergency analysis. She can have preliminary results within 24 hours if we can get her the signature samples. "What about Janet? Is she safe?" "My insurance company has arranged for her to be interviewed by federal agents this afternoon. They're treating her as a protected witness, which means Henderson can't retaliate against her without facing additional federal charges." "Can she still get the signature samples we need?" "That's the problem. Henderson has restricted her access to the filing systems, and he's monitoring her movements closely. We need another way to get authentic samples of Eduardo's signature for comparison." Maria thought quickly. "What about the payroll records? Papa signed his timesheet every week for 15 years. The Human Resources Department should have hundreds of examples of his genuine signature. Can you get access to those records?" "Not legally, but I know someone who might be able to help." Maria's plan was desperate and dangerous, but time was running out. She called Tommy Rodriguez, the site supervisor who had expressed doubts about Eduardo's guilt during her brief construction job. Tommy agreed to meet her at a bar near the hotel project after his shift ended. Tommy listened carefully as Maria explained what she had discovered about Henderson's fraud scheme. His anger was immediate and intense. "I knew something was wrong," he said, slamming his beer bottle on the table. "Eduardo was the most honest man I ever worked with, but Henderson has been acting strange for months. Secretive, paranoid, asking weird questions about who the workers talked to and what they discussed. Tommy, I need your help. We need signature samples from Papa's employment records to prove the authorization forms were forged. Can you get access to the HR files?" Tommy was quiet for a long time, weighing the risks against his loyalty to Eduardo. Finally, he nodded. "The HR manager is my cousin Rosa. She's worked there for 8 years and she's been suspicious about this whole situation too. If I explain what you found, she might be willing to help." "It has to be tonight. Henderson is planning to leave town soon, and once he's gone it will be much harder to prove Papa's innocence. Rosa works late on Thursdays doing payroll processing. The building is mostly empty after 6, and security is lighter than during regular business hours. If we're going to do this, tonight is probably our best opportunity." They spent the next hour planning their approach. Rosa would provide legitimate access to Eduardo's employment records, allowing them to photograph signature samples without technically breaking any laws. Tommy would act as lookout and help them avoid Henderson or his associates who might still be in the building. At 8:30 that evening, Maria met Tommy and Rosa at the Henderson development offices. Rosa was a nervous woman in her 50s who clearly understood the risk she was taking by helping them. "Eduardo was always kind to me," she explained as she unlocked the HR filing room. "When my husband was sick, Eduardo organized the other workers to cover his medical expenses. I can't stand by and watch him go to prison for something he didn't do." Rosa pulled Eduardo's employment file and spread his timesheets across a conference table. 15 years of weekly signatures created a comprehensive record of Eduardo's genuine handwriting, showing the natural variations and consistent characteristics that would prove the authorization forms were forgeries. Maria photographed each signature with her phone, creating a detailed database that the handwriting expert could use for comparison analysis. While she worked, Tommy monitored the building's entrances and Rosa organized the files to hide any evidence of their activity. They were nearly finished when Rosa's phone buzzed with a text message. Her face went white as she read it. Henderson is coming back to the building. One of the night janitors just texted me. His car is in the parking lot. Maria felt panic rising in her throat. If Henderson caught them in the HR office with Eduardo's files, he would know immediately what they were trying to prove. Worse, he might be able to use their unauthorized presence in the building to discredit any evidence they had gathered. How long do we have? Tommy asked. Maybe 5 minutes if he takes the elevator. Less if he uses the stairs. Maria frantically photographed the remaining signatures while Rosa returned the files to their proper locations. Tommy positioned himself by the door, listening for footsteps or elevator sounds that might indicate Henderson's approach. "We need to get out of here now," he whispered urgently. They turned off the conference room lights and moved toward the stairwell, hoping to reach the parking garage before Henderson discovered their presence. As they reached the stairwell door, they could hear the elevator arriving at their floor. Maria held her breath as footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, moving toward the HR office they had just evacuated. Henderson was checking the same areas. They had been searching, confirming her suspicion that he knew exactly what kind of evidence they were looking for. They made it to Rosa's car without being detected, but Maria knew their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Henderson was clearly aware that someone was building a case against him, and he would be taking steps to eliminate any remaining evidence that could link him to the theft. As Rosa drove them away from the building, Maria reviewed the signature photographs on her phone. She had everything the handwriting expert would need to prove the authorization forms were forged, but she wondered if it would be enough to save her father and expose Henderson's crimes. The final confrontation was coming, and Maria was about to discover whether her desperate investigation had uncovered enough truth to overcome months of carefully constructed lies. The handwriting analysis results arrived at 6 in the morning, 2 days before Eduardo's trial was scheduled to begin. Maria's phone rang as she was reviewing her father's case files one final time, and David's voice was electric with excitement. "Maria, we got him." Dr. Sarah Chen completed her analysis, and every single authorization signature is a forgery. The variations in letter formation, pen pressure, and stroke angle are consistent with someone who studied Eduardo's signature, but couldn't replicate the subconscious muscle memory patterns that create authentic handwriting. Maria felt tears of relief streaming down her face. After weeks of desperate investigation, they finally had concrete proof of her father's innocence. What happens now? Patricia is presenting the evidence to the federal prosecutor this morning. She's also filing a motion to delay the trial pending investigation of new evidence. With Janet's testimony, the insurance company findings, and now the handwriting analysis, the prosecution will have to seriously consider that they've been pursuing the wrong person. 2 hours later, Patricia called with an update that was both encouraging and frustrating. The prosecutor has agreed to postpone Eduardo's trial for 2 weeks while they investigate Henderson more thoroughly. They're not ready to drop the charges yet, but they're finally taking our alternative theory seriously. What about Henderson? Are they going to arrest him? That's the problem. When FBI agents went to question him yesterday, they discovered that he had already left for Colorado. His attorney claims it was a previously scheduled business trip, but Henderson isn't answering his phone and his construction equipment has been moved out of state. Maria felt her heart sink. Even with all the evidence they had gathered, Henderson might escape justice simply by disappearing before he could be held accountable for his crimes. Can they bring him back? Eventually, yes. But it will take time to get extradition orders and locate him in Colorado. If he decides to disappear completely, it could take months or years to track him down. That afternoon, Maria received an unexpected call that changed everything. Janet Morrison's voice was shaking with excitement and fear. "Maria, I found something. When I was cleaning out my desk yesterday, I discovered a recording device that Henderson had hidden to monitor employee conversations. But the device recorded everything, including Henderson's private phone calls from his office." "What kind of phone calls?" calls to people in Colorado about transferring money to offshore accounts, calls to lawyers about protecting assets from civil lawsuits, and most importantly, a call to someone named Victor Morales where Henderson explicitly discussed framing Eduardo for the theft. Maria could barely believe what she was hearing. "Do you still have the recording?" "I made copies and hid them in 3 different places. Henderson doesn't know the device was still active when he thought he had deactivated the surveillance system. Janet, you need to get those recordings to Patricia immediately. This could be the evidence that finally destroys Henderson's case." That evening, Maria sat in Patricia's office listening to the most damning recording she had ever heard. Henderson's voice was clear and unmistakable as he discussed his plans with someone he apparently trusted completely. "The Santos situation is working perfectly," Henderson said on the recording. "Eduardo signed all the authorization forms I needed, just like I knew he would. He trusts me completely, and his English isn't good enough to understand the legal implications of what he's signing." The other voice responded, "What if he figures out what's happening? By the time he realizes what's going on, the money will be safely transferred, and the FBI will find a clear trail leading directly to his computer credentials. I've been setting this up for 18 months. Every transaction is documented with his electronic signature. What about the other employees? Won't they be suspicious?" Henderson's laugh was cold and calculating. "I've done this twice before with immigrant workers. They make perfect scapegoats because they're afraid to fight back and their families can't afford expensive lawyers. Eduardo will probably take a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial, and I'll be free to relocate my operations to Colorado." Patricia paused the recording and looked at Maria with grim satisfaction. "This is it. This recording proves premeditation, conspiracy, and a pattern of targeting immigrant workers." Henderson's entire defense just collapsed. "Can we get Papa released immediately? I'm filing an emergency motion first thing tomorrow morning. With this recording, the prosecutor will have no choice but to drop all charges against Eduardo and issue federal warrants for Henderson's arrest." Maria felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that had been crushing her for months. Her father would be free, her family would be vindicated, and Henderson would face justice for his crimes. The next morning, Maria accompanied her mother to the county jail for what they hoped would be Eduardo's final day in custody. When the guards brought him to the visiting room, his face was gaunt and his shoulders were stooped, but his eyes lit up when he saw them. "Mija," he said to Maria, "your mama tells me you've been working very hard to help me, but I don't want you to sacrifice your life for an old man's problems." Maria took her father's hands through the reinforced glass. "Papa, you're going home today. We proved that Henderson stole the money and framed you for his crimes. The prosecutor is dropping all charges this afternoon." Eduardo stared at her in disbelief, then began crying tears of joy and relief. Her mother was sobbing in the chair beside her, and Maria felt her own tears flowing freely for the first time since this nightmare had begun. 3 hours later, Maria watched her father walk out of the county jail as a free man. Patricia had successfully argued for immediate dismissal of all charges, and the federal prosecutor had issued a public apology for the investigation's failures. Eduardo's record would be completely expunged, and he would be eligible for compensation for wrongful prosecution. The media attention was intense, but positive. Maria's investigation had exposed not only Henderson's specific crimes, but also a broader pattern of fraud that had victimized immigrant workers for years. The FBI launched a comprehensive review of similar cases, and several other victims came forward with stories of being framed for thefts committed by their employers. Henderson was arrested in Denver a week later, charged with federal fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations for targeting workers based on their immigration status. The evidence Maria had gathered formed the foundation of a case that would eventually result in his conviction and a 20-year prison sentence. 6 months later, Maria received a call from the FBI asking if she would be interested in working as a forensic investigator specializing in financial fraud cases. Her brothers, who had initially criticized her amateur detective work, now spoke proudly of their sister's determination and investigative skills. Eduardo returned to work in construction, but with a new company that valued his experience and treated him with the respect he deserved. He often told people that his daughter had saved not just his freedom, but his faith in American justice. Maria accepted the FBI position and eventually became one of the agency's most successful investigators of corporate fraud. She specialized in cases involving vulnerable workers and immigrant communities, using her experience with her father's case to identify patterns of exploitation that other investigators might miss. Her family never forgot the lesson they learned during those terrifying months, that sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who observe from the corners and take careful notes, are the ones who possess the determination and skills needed to fight for justice when it matters most. Maria had been forgotten in the chaos of her family's crisis, dismissed by her brothers and overlooked by the legal system. But she had returned from that isolation with the mission completed, her father's innocence proven, and a dangerous criminal exposed and convicted. The shy data analyst who had once lived in her brother's shadows had discovered her true calling as a seeker of truth and a defender of the innocent. In saving her father, she had also found herself and her purpose in life. Eduardo Santos was free, James Henderson was in prison, and Maria Santos had transformed from an overlooked daughter into a formidable force for justice. The mission that had begun with a desperate phone call on a Tuesday evening had ended with the triumph of truth over carefully constructed lies, and the victory of persistence over powerful adversaries.